The social consumption of alcoholic beverages among believers is more often than not um, a confrontational, controversial conversation. It holds debate and strong emotional investments in one's position. And both sides of the aisle and their positions have their go-to verses in the Bible in which they are firmly convinced teaches either or, interpretively. And I can understand, certainly, both sides in their passion to proclaim what they are firmly convinced the Bible teaches in regards to the social consumption of alcoholic beverages. Medicinal purposes aside, permissibilities, authorization, on the conversation of medical purposes, we put that aside in order to remain focused on the specificity of our conversation in this session, which is the social fellowship regarding or in participation with the consuming of alcoholic beverages. Okay? Could be holidays. Could be holidays with family or friends or neighbors. Could be a sports game. Could be going out to the restaurant together and just having ourselves a bottle of wine as friends, a few beers watching the game. There are believers who would quote scripture to their position, claiming that here's why that is permissible. Here's why I can hang out with the boys and have a few beers and watch the game. I can go out at the restaurant with family and have a glass of wine, have a bottle of wine among friends, sharing it. I can be at home and consume alcohol, perhaps with family or neighbor, or as long as, or as much as I do not become what each subjective description might hold in regards to drunkenness. That's one position that is quite common, and I think it's held in the majority of individuals who claim belief or Christianity. They would certainly take the position, or do take the position, that the consumption of alcoholic beverage in a social setting is permissible and enjoyable and practiced. And they have their verses in which they go to produce this. Many of them are commonly known, such as when Jesus turned water into wine. Jesus turned water into wine, therefore, all things in moderation, I can socially participate in consuming alcoholic beverages. There are other locations, of course. They would also find themselves in Ephesians, where Paul was speaking to the brethren there in regards to drunkenness. Do not become drunk. And they would utilize that verse in saying, Paul's not having a complete prohibition of alcohol here. He's just saying, if you are going to drink, do not drink to the measurement in which one would be commonly known as drunk. There is also another location where Paul was speaking to Timothy in regards to elders and deacons and whatnot, and they would say, Paul himself here says not to be given to much wine. You can consume a socially acceptable, moderate application of alcoholic beverages. It's permissible to a believer, a Christian, to do so, just as long as it is not much, that it doesn't become the measurement of drunkenness in regards to modern description or modern definition. So that's one side of the aisle, if you will. That's like one of the positions that is taken that I have come across in my limited experience since 2011 now. And there is the other position in opposition, which is we are prohibited, we are not authorized. It is an unlawful practice. It is a sin to consume any amount of alcoholic beverage for social fellowship. You cannot have a drink of wine or a drink of beer, period. And that is what the Bible teaches, and that is what they take in position. So you have both of these departments of believers who hold dear to their Bible verses and their position. Is it subjective? Does it really matter? One side, the side that says it is permissible, and who utilizes their Bible verses to say we can drink alcohol in moderation, socially, they would say it's a matter of one's personal opinion. It's a matter of one's personal conscience. If you feel you can drink a bit of alcohol socially and be okay with God, then that's between you and God, and that's up to you, and you go ahead and you do that. If you're a person who feels he cannot or she cannot consume any amount of alcohol whatsoever for social settings, then you don't do that. Then you stay far away from alcohol. You don't touch it at all. But ultimately, to the position of the individual who claims you can moderately consume for social purposes, we'll say ultimately it's subjective to a certain degree. It's up to you. As long as you do not enter into the definition we've given to drunkenness in our modern era. The other side of the aisle would say, no, the Bible does not teach that whatsoever. It is an objective, absolute standard of his doctrine. You cannot, in any portion or measurement, consume alcoholic beverages for the motivated purpose of socially acceptability in our society. You cannot do that. It is a sin. And they have their Bible verses to their position. And therein you can see how aggravated emotional investments come to confrontation or controversy and great debate. It is the same with a great many other topical industries, such as the use of mechanical instruments while congregated assembled together on Sunday for worship, delivering worship to God while utilizing mechanical instruments. One side of the aisle says it's permissible and enjoyable, and we utilize it. It's subjective. If you feel you're okay with God and your conscience to do so, then do so. It's permissible. And the other side says it is not. It is a violation of the doctrine. It is lawless, and it holds eternal consequence. And those same compartments of conversation I have experienced throughout the decade plus now among my brothers and sisters in the church. So we want to have ourselves a fair and reasonable conversation in regards to this topical trip. And we certainly want to have scriptural guidance and instruction to this end. It is true that at times both sides of the aisle utilize the scriptures for their own selfish ambition. They will do so with a already preconceived notion of their position, meaning they have a biased agenda. They're not going to truly humble themselves to the text in order to simply follow the instruction. They've already made their mind up, is the idea. They've already stubborned themselves into their position and will not deviate from it whatsoever, or entertain the thought that they might indeed be wrong with their position. And there's not much you can do when it comes to that end, if you will. But when we are open to the idea that we just might be wrong in our position, and that we simply seek to love Jesus as he has commanded us to love him, we, in reverence, bow ourselves before him in humble posture, seeking his forgiveness, seeking his guidance, his instruction, then it is my firm position and belief that the scriptures indeed reveal the message and the truth of this topical conversation. And I think we are wise to go that route. Now, we're going to pull up an article from apologeticspress.org. And it's a brief article from our brother Jeff. No, is it Jeff? I forget now. Let me check something just to be sure I don't get it wrong. Dave. There we go. A brother named Dave Miller. And the article is titled Elders, Deacons, Timothy, and Wine. So this will hold specific conversation in regards to, I believe, 1 Timothy, 1:8? 1 Timothy 1:8. Is it there, or 3:8? Let me check. I have that out here as well. 1 Timothy 3:8. Sorry. Which states, of course, that, well, let me just pull it up here. Well, give me a minute. We'll pull that up soon enough. Yeah. So this article, of course, is going to point to what they firmly believe the Bible teaches in regards to that Bible verse regarding not being given to much wine. That is a verse that one side of the aisle says, there it is. The verse gives permission to Christians, to believers, to consume alcoholic beverages in a social condition, in a social setting. The other side of the aisle says, no, that's not what that verse is saying. And here's why. Or here's the interpretation the scriptures is revealing in regards to that end. We will together, of course, read the article and see to which direction it points in the scriptures. I've not read the article before. Most of these articles, I do not read them before. I want them live and active with you. So we read them together, and I share, of course, my thoughts and my experience and my studies throughout the years, along with the article, whether they be in agreement or in disagreement. But ultimately, I think you and I, if I am to assume the greater good in our faith, I think you and I simply want to do what's right. And if doing what's right is permissible in our conscience to consume a moderate amount of alcoholic beverages, wine, or what is commonly known as spirits, or beer, or things like that, then for those of us who are capable of doing that, then we do that and still be pleasing to God. But if that would be my position, and through a humble seeking in the scriptures that it demands a change in my mind of position, then I want to do that. I want to be teachable when Jesus is the teacher. I want to be able to change my mind on things that I may hold dear, that I may have been fully convinced that I'm right with the Bible on. And the reason is because ultimately it's about Jesus. See, if it's about me, then it becomes a selfish endeavor to which I will never find any redemptive quality to change, because it's about me. And I could have deceived myself into believing it's about Jesus when in fact, in reality, it's about me. I must be ready to deny myself and the position I may have taken for decades if it means I will draw closer to God, if it means I must change, if it means that I may have even been an eternal consequence. I need to change position from one to the other or the other to one. Or again, maybe the scriptures reveal the fact that it doesn't matter. That it just doesn't matter. On this topical discussion, it doesn't matter. Whether you do or you don't, we can all be brethren in fellowship and go to heaven. Maybe that's what the Bible teaches. Maybe that's the position we held to. Again, we must, I think, if we are genuine, if we are authentic, if we are honest students of the scriptures, and we truly, genuinely seek to follow Jesus faithfully. It's when it comes to all these controversial conversations among Christians and believers and what the Bible says and the various interpretations therein, if we are not humble to truly seek Jesus and follow his word, then it's all for naught. It's in vain. This whole session is useless. Why even bother with it? But if we are passionately seeking to better our faith, or to be transferred from a lost position, meaning a position that would have us in eternal torment, transferred, withdrawn from that location of darkness into a location of salvation, a location of eternal paradise, then we should be ready to deny ourselves in any compartment or department of conversation and thought or belief or worldview if we indeed are genuine to Jesus. If we want to follow Jesus, then we should be ready to do that. I've been taking, of course, a large portion here of this session in introductory, because ultimately it's going to land where it always lands, a matter of the heart. A matter of the heart. Are we willing to do what's right? Are we willing to change for Jesus? Maybe we don't need to. Maybe we are already in fellowship with Jesus in the position we take in regarding this topical discussion. But maybe not. I myself, as long as with anyone else in equality, must be ready to change our mind if the information demands it. So what we're going to do, of course, is pull up the verse in question. And there are many verses, and there may be other sessions in regards to this kind of topical direction, but for this session, it will be 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 8, in regards to the description of elders and deacons and whatnot, and how Paul said that deacons should be not given to much wine. Does that mean that we can consume alcoholic beverages in moderation, socially, right? Or does it say we can't? I mean, let's be honest with the information of the scriptures. And we're simply pulling up an article from our friends over at apologeticspress.org to read their information, their studies. They are scholarly, they are trustable, and they deliver a well-written, they deliver well-written material and produce content that has substance, that leads us to the Bible, to which you and I, of our own independent accountability, can make sense of and take a position. The idea, of course, is to interpret the Bible in a rightly handled way, so it does not contradict itself. It does not pin one verse against another, that it cooperates together as a well-written symphony. That's how we are commanded to utilize the Bible. And we want to do that so that the author's intent is delivered in our minds, where faith is grown within and produced outwardly. And that's important when it comes to this topical discussion, of course. So I'm going to put up the Bible verse in question on the screen, and then we'll pull up the article and we'll read together as we've been doing. Friends, if you're new here, my name is Stéphane Maillet. AddedSouls.com is the website. I labor alongside the East Coast Church of Christ over here in New Brunswick, Canada. And you can check out the .com, eastcoastchurchofchrist.com, or our Facebook page, East Coast Church of Christ. We'd love to have you come study with us. Reach out to us and we can have ourselves a wonderful conversation. All right, so let's put this up on the screen here. And friends, please consider following, liking, sharing this link far and wide. Others out there might find value in this kind of content and may want to tap in. By all means, leave a comment, say hi, how you doing? The engagement allows the algorithm wave to kind of surf us in the right direction, reaching a great many souls out there. So the verse in question, of course, is 1 Timothy 3:8. And I utilize BibleHub.com quite often because it shows us all the various Bible versions, and you can go into the Greek and various locations, and it's a study tool of sorts. It may be a bit surface, but there is, enough information there to help an individual know what the Bible is teaching on a certain word or a certain verse. So the verse in question, of course, and the first version here is the New International Version, which says, and I quote, "In the same way, deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine." And again, the argument is made on one side that not indulging in much wine means we can drink some wine, just not indulge in much of it. So you can, and that remains subjective. That remains subjective, meaning it's different for everyone. God did not put a law for that. For me, it might be 3-4 glasses of wine. For you, it might be 2 or 1. For another, it may be a bottle of wine. It's subjective, and God made that permissible for each one's conscience and opinion. That's how one side of the fence would interpret that. That's how they would deliver that message, if you will. And not pursuing dishonest gain. The NLT, the ESV says, "Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine." So the ESV says addicted to much, and the NIV said indulging in much, which is interesting because indulging and addicted, I don't know if they're the same definition or they would be defined the same. I don't think so. I think there's a difference there. Let me see. What about the King James Bible would say, "Likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy or filthy lucre." So not given to. One says not to indulge, right? The NIV says indulging in much wine. The ESV says addicted to much wine. And the KJV says not given to much wine. The New King James would say not given to much wine as well. The New American Standard would say not prone to drink much wine. My translation here, this is the one I utilize, the 95, addicted or addicted to much wine. So they use addicted there as well. They use the word addicted there as well. So that's the verse in question, right? And there are, again, many verses that are utilized on one side of the fence to authorize the consumption of alcoholic beverages among believers, among Christians. And this is one of them, and that's why we're looking at it. So we're going to pull up the article now from our friends over at apologeticspress.org. The article titled Elders, Deacons, Timothy, and Wine, written by our brother Dave Miller. And we begin. I'm going to begin reading and see what it says, all right? We'll see which direction it's bringing us. It always brings us to the scriptures. We just have to put on our thinking hats and be reasonable individuals, civil and mature, loving one another, being respectful, being kind, and being honest with the text and seeking to truly do what's right, to believe what the Bible wants us to believe, and to follow Jesus in good faith. So the article begins and it says, I quote, Paul's instructions pertaining to the qualifications of elders and deacons have created misunderstanding regarding the use of alcoholic beverages. I agree with that. Elders are not to be, quote, given to wine, 1 Timothy 3:3. While deacons are not to be, quote, given to much wine, 1 Timothy 3:8. Already at this position, or at this time, I would think, is there a difference in command or in law between the elder and the deacon? Like if I am new to this conversation and I'm simply trying to make sense of it, if one verse says that the elder should not be given to wine, and the deacon verse says much wine, is there a difference in the law delivered or the instruction? Is it better for the elder to not touch alcohol at all, even in social, in social moderate situations? But the deacon, he is permitted to? Is there a difference in influence or how God sees both offices of servitude? That's a question. I mean, why would one verse say that the elders can't or should not, and then one verse for the deacon say you can moderately? That's interesting to me. That's a question, of course, we can ask ourselves. We go back to the article here and keep reading. Translations further obscure the matter by their variety of terminology. Yeah, that's kind of like what we were doing before we got into this article. We were looking at the various different Bible translations and versions and how they use certain words. The ASV, the American Standard Version, has, quote, no brawler in verse 3, and, quote, not given to much wine in verse 8. Now, the New International Version has, quote, not given to much wine in verse 3, as we saw, and, quote, not indulging in much wine in verse 8. The New American Standard Bible has, quote, not addicted to wine. We saw that, didn't we? And, quote, not addicted to much wine. So from verse 3 to verse 8, it's interesting to see the dynamic and change. What does that mean? So the question is, of course, does 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 8 sanction moderate alcohol use? Does that verse, in its context, in its teaching, meaning the message that Paul would want us to understand even to this day and age, is the message permissibility or authorization for the consumption of alcoholic beverages in moderation for social setting, for social purposes? Does that verse permit or teach such a position? Now, the phrase in verse 3 consists of two Greek words. And I'm not going to be able to pronounce this properly, but, bear with me. Suffer long. So the phrase in verse 3 consists of two Greek words, parentheses, mi paroinos, and literally translated means not beside, by, or at wine. That's what it literally means. Mi paroinos. Mi paroinos. Okay? That, of course, citing its reference to Vine and Robertson. The article continues. The phrase is enjoining abstinence, and perhaps even the act of situating oneself in the presence of people and places where the consumption of alcoholic beverages is occurring. So, in other words, the literal reality of mi paroinos means not beside, by, or at wine. And so the phrase is enjoining abstinence and perhaps even the act of situating oneself in the presence of people and places where the consumption of alcoholic beverages is occurring. A drinking party, perhaps, or a location, again, that is designed to facilitate the participants into alcoholic consumption and where that is engaged. So the ASV translated the expression, quote, brawler, to emphasize the violent behavior that proceeds from the use of alcohol. Okay? And for those of us who lived in the world of alcohol consumption, not only socially, but in its excess, we've, of course, come across this quite often, more so often than not, where the consumption of alcohol has attained a measurement in which the individual has lost complete ability to, or has completely lost access to the faculty of his or her mind. And they become belligerent, heavy-handed, and forceful in seeking confrontation. They seek violence, unrighteous violence, and seek to participate in brawling. That is a common character seen at the bar, at the honky-tonk, at the location where it is designed to facilitate alcoholic consumption to those engaging in that practice. And in plain language, of course, as always, we were always drinking alcohol. We were always at drinking parties, and there was always one or two or a few who were going to get drunk and who are going to want to fight. And that's just what it is. The kind of individuals where they show up to the party and you're like, oh, great, here they are. Someone's getting knocked out at the end of the day here. Things like that. A brawler, someone who loves to fight. And they typically are found in those locations. Okay, so just contributing, if you will, to the description and definition of brawler within the confine and context of alcohol, okay? Calling for elders, again, it says the ASV translated the expression brawler to emphasize the violent behavior that proceeds from the use of alcohol. Calling for the elders to be abstinent is consistent with other terms used in the same listing. Nephalian in 1 Timothy 3:2, quote, free from intoxicants, and abstinent in respect to wine. And sophrona, Titus 1:8, which is, quote, of a sound mind, temperate, in control of one's intellectual faculty, his thinking mind, his independent accountability, and free will. You are in control of your mind. The elder must be in control of his mind, and so therefore must not fall prey to the vices of the brawler or the intoxicant or the charm of the alcoholic persuasion. Quote, sober-minded. Quote, self-controlled. So elders must refrain from the use of intoxicants. according, of course, to the information that is expressed within the idea of the verse, its interpretation. And they must not associate with places and people who use them. Again, it's incumbent of us to have a humble, sincere, and submissive heart to the information of the Scripture, and that we can reason with one another in regards to the conversation. How could an elder who is to shepherd the flock, in the utility of expediency, and in matters of scruple or conscience, opinion, judgment, personal and public, for the security of the flock, how could a man who qualifies for that office of servitude be productive spiritually if he is governed even to a minimal portion of his mind by the consumption of alcoholic beverages for social engagements, even in moderation? Perhaps one says it doesn't. It does not hinder at all his ability to be productive and to shepherd the flock. Over here in this country, there are several locations and churches where you can go to, and some of the elders will have you over in hospitality and offer you a glass of wine, alcoholic wine. The flock they shepherd seem to have no issue with that. They would say it doesn't hinder his ability to serve. It is a matter of one's own personal conscience. Yet again, as I'm trying to reason with what the Scriptures would say in regards to the words and the meaning of the words, it seems quite clear to me, and again, I may be wrong, that Paul would guide the elders to remain free from even the moderate consumption of alcoholic beverages for social purposes. Okay, well, in verse 8, the four words used to qualify deacons on this point, parentheses, mi oino polo processiontas, mi oino polo processiontas, are literally translated. That kind of sounds Spanish, doesn't it? I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just reading words. But I mean, you can see it there on the screen. Mi oino polo processiontas are literally translated, quote, not wine much occupied with. Not wine much occupied with. So that is the literal translated mi oino polo processiontas. Okay. Now, does the use of the word, quote, much, because that seems to be the word that is causing controversy, I suppose, or that is causing debate, and how both sides of the fence is interpreting this here word. Does the use of the word much mean that deacons may imbibe a moderate measurement amount of wine? Is that what much means? Or does it make it at the very least permissible? So at least three alternative interpretations are possible here. Okay, this is an article from our friends over at apologeticspress.org, written by Dave Miller. So if you are seeking to read it again on your own time and dime, by all means, please check it out. Their work is sound, from what I have been able to recognize. They point us to the Bible every time. And I'm not saying I may agree with every single thing they create. We may have a difference in opinion, but I believe us to be quite like-minded in the doctrine of Christ, and so, by all means, check them out. So first, when Solomon said, quote, "Do not be overly wicked," found in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 17, or the New King James would say over wicked, and the NIV would say over much wicked, or maybe I've got that upside down here. The New King James would say, "Do not be overly wicked." The NIV would say over wicked, and the ASV would say over much wicked. So, when Solomon said, "Do not be overly wicked," did he mean to imply that a person can, with God's approval, be moderately wicked? Okay, so that's an honest question. And of course, the question may come from two different departments of motive. Here we go again. Yes, I'm going to repeat the illustration because it works. Two individuals, same neighborhood. Two members of the same community. Two individuals asking the same question in the same neighborhood. The question is, are there any police officers here? So where's the difference? Well, the motive of the heart, of course. How so? Well, if two individuals in the same community are asking the same question, are there any police officers here? One of them is asking for public assistance. He needs help from the law. Why? His house has been burglarized. Are there any police officers here? It's desperate. It's passionate. Please, I need help from the law. Someone has burglarized my house. The other individual in question is asking the same question. Are there any police officers here? Why? He just burglarized his neighbor's house. He's seeking to evade, to avoid, to run away from the law and any public service that would have to do with the law. Sadly, many believers can't discern the difference between the two, and they side, encourage, promote, and endorse the burglar. Oh yeah, I've seen that happen time and time again. We see it all the time. Sadly, some brethren who have been in the church for decades and are of a notable name and have some influence on social media, we've seen them publicly endorse the bad guy and continue to participate in the slander of the good guy. Well, can we determine the difference? Can we discern the information? And does it apply? Is it the same? Or is Dave here comparing apples to oranges, right? Though I would say apple and oranges, are they not both fruits? Okay, I don't know. Be moderate and wicked. So there is a Bible verse that says, do not be overly wicked. You can find that in the scriptures in Ecclesiastes 7:17. So from that verse, can we ask the question, is it okay then? Is it permissible for us to be moderately wicked? Again, we're connecting this to the word much. The word much found in 1 Timothy 3:8. If the Bible says not be given to much wine, does that permit us to have a moderate amount of wine? The same principle in word. Now, we have to reason with this. Either we will agree or disagree with, of course, how the principle is applied or interpreted. But in Ecclesiastes 7:17, it says, do not be overly wicked. So, in same like manner and principle, can we say, oh, all right, can we be moderately wicked? Like, perhaps I am not permitted to fornicate, 7 times a week. But perhaps I can fornicate 3 times a week, 2 times a week. I am not permitted to drink, 72 beers. But am I permitted to drink 12? A position would say, well, that's up to you, and God permits you to know when it's up to you. The law is drunkards, drunkenness. Those who live a lifestyle of drunkenness cannot enter into heaven. However, to your own subjective conscience, you can drink alcohol to a certain degree, as long as you do not enter into the lifestyle of it all. Interesting conversations. I mean, again, asking myself questions. And for transparency purposes, I mean, I'm an alcoholic. I will always be. Now, I'm on the wagon, obviously. I have fell off a few times, but I didn't stay off. I got back on, and I confessed my sins to God and in privacy to those I can confide in, who love me, who want to help me make it to heaven. And you try again. I mean, we lived in my past life a daily consumption of alcohol, and it was not moderate. We didn't fall into that category. It was not social. It was to the excess of that lifestyle, which was more along the lines of a more heathen or pagan worldview and practice. Well, can I quench my addiction or my temptations by drinking a few beers at night? I don't need to drink 24 of them, but maybe I can drink a 6-pack in moderation, socially, or half a bottle of wine. There is a position that would say yes among believers, as long as your conscience is clear with God as you do so, and as long as you do not fall prey to the modern definition of drunkenness, which we apply to a first century word. And I think that I have a problem with that. It's the same, I should say, as today, you have individuals who utilize the word miracle quite often. I've witnessed a miracle. But is the definition of the word miracle utilized in our current era the same in measurement to how it was utilized in the Bible in the first century when a supernatural occurrence would take place? Well, that's an important question to ask. Are we dumbing down, if you will, watering down the definition of a word? Well, is the word wine of the first century the same as it is today? Are we taking modern definitions to what we commonly now know in our age as wine and forcing it into the first century dialect? Again, important questions to ask. So when Peter noted that pagans do not understand why Christians do not engage in the, quote, same excess of riot, in 1 Peter 4:4, again, we're in the principle of reasoning here with other verses that utilize similar verbiage as much wine found in 1 Timothy 3:8. So, again, for the thought, let's repeat. When Peter noted that pagans do not understand why Christians do not engage in the, quote, same excess of riot, 1 Peter 4:4, did Peter mean moderate rioting was appropriate? If Ecclesiastes 7:17 says, do not be overly wicked, can we be moderately wicked? If 1 Peter 4:4 says, quote, same excessive riot, did he mean or give permissibility for moderate rioting? I think obviously at this point, if we are honest to following Jesus, humble to just know what he wants us to do because he's our master. He is our king, and he loves us greatly. He gave his life for us. At the very least, we should deny ourselves and selfishness, remove ourselves from pride or preconceived agenda, and simply just reason with each other here. Like, I think we would not agree with moderate wickedness or moderate rioting. And I think if we're honest, we're not going to make the leap and say, well, that's different. I don't know if it's different. It kind of seems to be the same principle argument here. In other words, language can forthrightly condemn an excessive indulgence or great amount of an action without implying that the action is permissible in a lesser amount or to a lesser degree. That's a reasonable statement. That's a reasonable argument. I think it's fair. One cannot assume that what is unlawful in excess is lawful in smaller amounts. And I know we agree with that from both sides of the aisle. The side of the aisle of believers that say, yes, it is permissible and it should and can be practiced to consume alcoholic beverages for social engagements. Yes, it is. Yes, you can. It's not a sin. Go ahead and enjoy it if your conscience permits it. That position would agree along with the other position that says you cannot consume any amount of alcoholic beverage for public social fellowship. It's a sin. It's lawlessness. It will cause great eternal consequence. Both sides would agree with this reasoning here at this time, which says, do you believe we can moderately be wicked? No, of course not. Of course not. Okay, well, the article continues here. We can refer to a person's frequent involvement in a certain activity, an example, adultery, without intending to leave the impression that a more moderate participation in the action would be proper. I think we're honest enough to understand that position. I do not believe, and I know you do not believe as well, that the doctrine of Christ would tell us adultery, an adulterer cannot enter into heaven unless he diminishes the measurement of his participation, and then leave us to our own conclusion or interpretation to when that is. Okay, again, back to what I utilized with fornication. As an adulterer, can I practice adultery 7 times a week? No, that's too much. Who says so? God, in a certain position, would permit us to decide the subjectivity or the measurement, the rod, where that would be. I say 7 is permissible. 8, however, would not be permissible. 8 would be the measured amount that would cause us eternal consequence. Well, both of us know that would kind of be a foolish position to take. I think adultery, period, scripturally revealed, is a practice we cannot participate even one time, or it will cause eternal consequence. Albert Barnes addressed this point succinctly. Quote, "It is not affirmed that it would be proper for the deacon, any more than the bishop, to indulge in the use of wine in small quantities. But it is affirmed that a man who is much given to the use of wine ought not, on any consideration, to be a deacon." Now, this is just the words of a man. It's not book, chapter, verse quote from the scriptures, but I think there's a reasonable thought to it. Again, if we're being honest, I think there's a reasonable thought to it. So the word in the verse 8, translated, quote, "given to," parentheses, KJV, New King James, ASV, or, quote, "indulging in," that would be from the NIV, or, quote, "addicted to," that would be the RSV, is prosecco. I know I'm not pronouncing it properly, but that's the word, prosecco. It's used elsewhere in 1 Timothy, by the way, 1 Timothy 4, and in Titus, chapter 1, verse 14, to refer to those who, quote, "give heed to," the KJV, or, quote, "occupy themselves with," the RSV, or, quote, "pay attention to," the NASB, Jewish myths. Who would draw the conclusion that Paul intended to encourage Christians to give some attention to Jewish myths, just not too much attention? Again, both sides of the aisle here would agree. Yet, somewhere from the agreement on these arguments, both parties would agree, yep, you're spot on. You cannot moderately practice wickedness. You cannot moderately practice riot. You cannot moderately, of course, yeah. But somewhere from there to the conversation of social consumption of alcoholic beverages, a change takes place. Not for one position, however. For one position, it remains solid. But for the other side of the coin, there is a change. Why is that? What's the science behind it? Why would one side change? Okay, so we agree thus far, of course, with that information. I continue with the article, quoting now, consequently, and friends, please consider liking, sharing, give a thumbs up, right, to the video feed, drop a comment, say hi, how's it going, anything, really, if you are engaged, if you find substance, and consider, please, to follow, to subscribe, to hit the notifications. There's many out there who may want to tap into this kind of information with us and have conversation with it. As always, my name is Stefan Maye, and I labor alongside the East Coast Church of Christ over here in New Brunswick, Canada. You can check out the .com, East Coast Church of Christ, or our Facebook page, East Coast Church of Christ. So the article continues, and it says, consequently, Paul was spotlighting an individual who is known for drinking freely of alcoholic beverages. Consequently, Paul was spotlighting an individual who is known for drinking freely of alcoholic beverages. He was saying that no such person should be put into the eldership. A parallel would be to make an observation about a person who carouses and parties every night. Quote, do not put such a man into the eldership. But the speaker hardly would mean that one who parties less frequently, say on weekends only, would be acceptable. Okay, so let's reason with that. We're going to read that again, okay? Just so we can reason together with this, okay? Paul was spotlighting an individual who is known for drinking freely of alcoholic beverages. He was saying that no such person should be put into the eldership. A parallel would be to make an observation about a person who carouses and parties every night. Quote, do not put such a man into the eldership. But the speaker hardly would mean that one who parties less frequently, say on weekends only, would be acceptable. Paul no more intended to suggest that leaders in the church who use small amounts of alcohol are suited to their role than Mosaic law would have permitted priests to do so. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 9. Barnes commented and said, quote, the way in which the apostle mentions the subject here would lead us fairly to suppose that he did not mean to commend its use in any sense. In any sense. So that's the first possibility here. A second possibility is that the terminology that Paul used was a loose form of speech. We are, of course, in conversation regarding 1 Timothy 3:8. Regarding not indulging in much wine. Does that permit us to moderately consume alcoholic beverages for social purposes? One side says yes, one side says no. We are reading an article from apologeticspress.org. Both Greek and Hebrew manifest such tendencies. For example, and this, of course, to the second possibility, that the terminology that Paul used was a loose form of speech. Both Greek and Hebrew manifest such tendencies. For example, quote, 3 days and 3 nights was a loose form of speech used in antiquity to refer to 2 days and a portion of a third. Right? Later in the same letter, Paul instructed Timothy to, quote, use a little wine for his stomach and infirmities, chapter 5, verse 23. It is not a foregone conclusion that the, quote, wine Paul commended to Timothy was inebriating, since evidence from antiquity exists to suggest that he was referring to the addition of grape juice to Timothy's drinking water for medicinal purposes. And I've studied more so in depth that portion of interpretation, and there is credibility to it. It validates, truly, that the context would be speaking of non-alcoholic grape juice. But even if, however, Paul meant for Timothy to add fermented, in other words, intoxicating juice to his diet, he nevertheless implied that, number one, Timothy had been abstinent up to that point, right? Number two, that the quantity he was now to add to his diet was to be a little, a moderate portion. And number three, that the juice was to be diluted with water. Number four, that its use was strictly medicinal in nature, not social, not casual, or recreational. And number five, that it took the directive of an apostle for Timothy to introduce its use into his life and body. I mean, those are interesting points. And if we are, again, sincere to it, it kind of makes sense. It kind of governs our thoughts towards what it is the Bible truly is speaking in regards to this topical conversation. Incidentally, one must not automatically assume that it was the wine that possessed medicinal properties. The wine may have simply been the antiseptic means to purify the polluted water that Timothy had been drinking by killing germs and bacterial organisms, thereby reducing their ill effect on Timothy's fragile stomach, in which case, Paul was not commending wine, he was commending a method for cleansing contaminated water. I mean, this is plausible. It makes sense. It could very well be. If Paul sanctioned the use of alcohol only on the qualifications that it was in small quantities and that it was for medicinal purposes, why would he then turn right around and sanction deacons drinking alcohol in larger amounts, avoiding only excess? Like, why do that? Wouldn't that cause a breach of logic? The inconsistency of this viewpoint, of course, becomes exceedingly apparent when one compares Paul's instructions to different Christians. Elders, 1 Timothy 3, verse 2 and 3, abstain. Nephalios, don't even be near it. Mi paroino. That's for elders. Deacons, 1 Timothy 3, 8, drink moderately. Mi oino polo. Wives, 1 Timothy 3:11, abstain, nephalios. Aged men, Titus 2:2, abstain, nephalios. Aged women, Titus 2:3, drink moderately, mi oino polo. So in view of these inconsistencies, quote, much wine must be a loose form of speech intended to express complete restraint in the use of wine. So a third possible interpretation of this verse concerns the meaning of the term wine. Unlike the English word parentheses, which always connotes an alcoholic beverage, the Greek word oinos is a generic term that includes all forms of the grape. All forms of the grape. The term oinos was used by the Greeks to refer to unfermented grape juice every bit as much as fermented juice. And therein, of course, we find perhaps a bit of confusion, but it's on our end. The context delivers which side of the interpretation is proper to the chapter, to the verse, to the teaching. Consequently, the interpreter must examine the biblical context in order to determine whether fermented or unfermented liquid is intended. In light of this realization, some have suggested that Paul instructed the elders to refrain completely from alcoholic beverages, while deacons, on the other hand, were being instructed to engage in a moderate use of non-alcoholic grape juice. At least 3 lines of argumentation are evident for this interpretation. First, in the Old Testament, the generic Hebrew term that is equivalent to oinos is yayin. Some passages praise the ingestion of yayin, Song of Solomon 5:1, Psalm 104:15, Ecclesiastes 9:7, while others condemn it. Proverbs 20, verse 1, 31, verse 4. The only plausible explanation is that the former is a reference to grape juice, while the latter is a reference to grape juice that has been transformed into an alcoholic beverage. And that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. That would be reasonable. That would not cause opposition or contradiction, but would rather reveal to us, again, though the same word, it's a different meaning to the word, pending on the direction of the context. When in the negative, we are speaking of fermented grape juice, since now become alcoholic beverage. When in the positive, we recognize that it is simply grape juice. Second, the article continues, only in Timothy and Titus, and in Titus is the word much. Only in Timothy and Titus is the word much used, as if the secret to pleasing God lies in the quantity of liquid ingested. If fermented juice were intended, the same distinction surely would have been made in the Old Testament. No such distinction is made. But if non-alcoholic grape juice is intended in Timothy and Titus, the intent of the qualification shifts from the level of intoxication to the matter of liquid gluttony. In that case, Paul intended to require moderation in the intake of non-alcoholic liquids. Third, biblical warnings against the excessive intake of food and liquid are legion. An example, Deuteronomy 21:20, Proverbs 23:20, 1 Corinthians 11:21 and 22, Titus 1:12. Solomon even applied the principle to honey in Proverbs 25:27. To understand Paul to be enjoining moderate use of a good gift from God, in other words, grape juice, is consistent with the context that is riddled with references to self-control, temperance, and moderation. Example, of course, 1 Timothy 3, verse 2 and verse 11. It also fits the social conditions extent in Greco-Roman culture in which intemperance was rampant. So in addition to the above considerations, one must keep in mind that even if it could be proved that God sanctioned moderate drinking of alcohol beverages in the Bible, it does not follow that God sanctions drinking moderate wine, since the wine referred to in the Bible was unlike the wine of our day. Wine in antiquity was far less potent. One would have to ingest large quantities in order to receive even minimal alcoholic content. The ancients typically had to add drugs to their drinks to increase their intoxicating potency. In light of all these considerations, the view that maintains that deacons may drink moderate amounts of alcoholic beverages is precarious, dangerous, and biblically unsubstantiated. And therein concludes the article from our friends over at apologeticspress.org. And I think we are wise, of course, to consider the article and the scholarly delivery of its education. And there is so much more that could be said in regards to the practice of social alcoholic drinking. We've run out of time, of course. There may be other session series to this topical point, But again, the more we submit to the nature of God throughout both of his testaments, and as we seek to be good stewards of this existence on this earth for the cause of our Lord and Master, I think we can conclude it is wise for one to stay away from social acceptance in that department. Yeah. What are your thoughts? What do you think about all this? All right, friends, we'll let you go for now. By all means, please consider subscribing, liking, following, drop a comment, all that kind of wonderful stuff. Friends, again, I labor alongside the East Coast Church of Christ over here in New Brunswick, Canada. You can check us out, eastcoastchurchofchrist.com, or our Facebook page, East Coast Church of Christ. Our podcast is all over the place, if you will. It's on Substack, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google, everywhere. And we'd love, of course, for you to get involved and partake in this mission we have over here. It's a beautiful, growing, and healthy church. It's a mustard seed, and we're doing everything we can to live upright and move forward and be productive, right? Maybe you'd like to participate in that. By all means, reach out to us and take hold of the opportunity. That all right? Hope you have yourself a wonderful day. Stay focused, stay positive. You are loved and you are appreciated. And we will certainly, Lord willing, meet up again tomorrow, 9 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. From Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Sign up to addedsouls.locals.com. You can sign up over there and support me, my family, the Added Souls work, and the mission over here with the East Coast congregation. You can do that over there, and you have exclusive content over there, of course. We get more personal updates, reports, things like that, our lifestyle. And, yeah, that's available to you. Good stuff? All right. Peace out.